LeaderCast.
Hi, and welcome to Deep Leadership. I'm your host, John Rennie. Well, I hope all is well with you today. This is another special Wednesday morning episode brought to you by our sponsor, Jeremy Clevenger Fitness, who we featured on episode 145. Now, if you've listened to the show for a while, you know that Jeremy has helped me get in the best shape of my life in 2022. And if you're planning on working on your health and fitness goals in 2023, I encourage you to put Jeremy in your corner to help you as well. There are links in the show notes to find all of his services. I have another great show lined up for you today, but before we get started, I just wanted to remind you to check out the leadership books I've written on either Amazon or my website, johnsrennie.com. This year, I'm offering a new way to purchase all of my books for a discount. I've bundled the books into what I call the Qualified Watchstander series, and you'll get all 3 books for 15% off the individual prices. This offer is only available on my website, so check it out if you're going to step up your leadership game in 2023. Also, as a reminder, Deep Leadership is ranked in the top 2% most popular shows out of 3 million podcasts globally and is now ranked in the top 100 management shows in the U.S., thanks to your support. I wanted to thank each and every one of you for listening in every week and sharing these episodes with your friends. You have helped this podcast grow into a top-performing show. So thank you very much. Well, that is it. Today we're going to be talking to a guest who had a remarkable leadership experience. His name is Jim Rafferty, and a terrible tragedy occurred in his community which led him to assume the leadership of a Boy Scout troop, something he had never done before. He became a leader by accident, and the lessons he learned were powerful. I'm so glad I got a chance to talk to Jim about his experience, and I know this conversation will impact your leadership journey as well. So, are you ready to dive in? Let's get started.
Welcome to Deep Leadership. Leadership is a people business. That's the philosophy of your podcast host, John Rennie. As a former Cold War submarine officer who spent 20-plus years leading businesses in corporate America before starting his own manufacturing business, he knows that leadership matters. Are you ready for some real-world, actionable advice from John as well as his expert guests?
I'm ready.
The show starts right now.
Welcome to the Deep Leadership Podcast. Today I'm joined by Jim Rafferty. Jim is a marketing and communication consultant and principal of JMRketing. He is a former radio announcer and program director. Jim helps business leaders communicate better, writing in a conversational, entertaining style. He's also a former Boy Scout leader, which serves as the catalyst for his book, Leader by Accident. In this book, Jim tells the story of how an unexpected volunteer leadership role fueled an even more unexpected journey into entrepreneurship. I am excited to have him on the show to learn from his unique experiences. So, Jim, welcome to the program.
Thanks, John. Excited to be here. Appreciate it.
Yeah, your story is really interesting, and I'm really glad that we have you on the show to hear from you and also hear the lessons that you learned, how you applied them as an entrepreneur as well. And there's so many great leadership lessons in this book. So I want to just kind of have this conversation, try to uncover those things and help our listeners kind of take that next level in their leadership journey. So, but before we get into too much, let's talk about what happened. Tell us what happened that thrust you into this unexpected leadership role. It is just the most crazy story. And it's almost hard to believe when I was reading through it that this could happen so close to home. So tell us a little bit about what happened and how you ended up in the leadership role.
Yeah, the really difficult part here is at the beginning of both our discussion and at the book, where a local attorney here in the Baltimore area and his wife and 2 younger sons were all shot to death by their oldest son, who was then 15 years old. And I come into that story because John, the father, was the scoutmaster of the Boy Scout troop that our son Matt belonged to at the time. And a couple of days after that, I was the new scoutmaster of the troop, which, for reasons we'll get into, was something of a surprise and extremely unexpected in a lot of ways. And so the story begins really with sort of being thrown into a leadership position at a really, really difficult time. For an organization that we didn't know whether it would survive or not. We had about 25 young men in the troop at that time, all of a sudden reduced by about 3. And, at this critical moment, they turned to a guy, me, who had been a Boy Scout for all of about 2 weeks as a kid. I really didn't like it. Had no position in the troop. I didn't really want a position in the troop, if I'm being honest, and didn't have any kind of, outdoor skills that you would want to scoutmaster in terms of being a camper or an avid hiker or anything like that. And so it was kind of odd to me. And I tell the story in the book about sitting in the room where this decision was being made and finally looking around the room at the committee, the troop committee, and saying, folks, there are 11 people or 12 people in this room, and 11 of them have more scouting experience than I do. So I'm not sure why you're asking me, but if this is what you think is best for the troop right now, then okay, I'll give it a try. And, that was among the most life-changing decisions I've ever made, really. The next 5 years that I served as Scoutmaster were just an unbroken string of challenges and lessons and learning. And a little further on in the discussion, we'll talk about, sort of some of the real life repercussions that had for me, if you will.
So I'm trying to get this, I'm trying to put the picture together. So you have basically the Scoutmaster is murdered, and including the two of the boys that were in the troop by one of the other boys. And so three
all three were in the troop. Yeah, all three were in the troop.
And it's not a Boy Scout troop with 200 members. This is 20 something. It's a small community of, I would say, is it all young men or is it young men and women in this troop?
At that time, it was all young men. And I always make it a point to say this when I tell this story to a group too, that John and Tammy, the parents, were everywhere in our community, not just scouts, but, coaching youth sports and swim team. And everywhere you went, they were PTA, they were doing good things. So, our little slice of the story, even as a scout troop, in the grand scope of what happened, was really a pretty small part of it. But it certainly changed things for me in a big way.
What went through your head when you said yes? Because, as you said, you not had a lot of experience in scouting. You didn't have a lot of outdoor skills. You probably have never yet led a group of young men or deal with a tragedy of this type, because nobody does that, right? Right.
Yeah.
Nobody has that kind of experience. Very few people in the world have that kind of experience. So I was just curious, what went through your head to say, yes, I want to do this. Yes, I want to step up. Yes, I want to lead.
I had a little warning that I was going to be asked, and not a lot, but like a day. It sort of gradually became clear over maybe 48 hours that I was going to be asked. So it wasn't a complete surprise, and I had a little time to think and reflect. And among those reflections, I flashed back to a conversation my son and I had just randomly about 6 months before that at a scout camping trip. We were together, and he had just turned to me and said, you're one of their favorite leaders, meaning the other boys in the troop. And I thought nothing of it at the time. I thought, well, that's nice, but I didn't want the word leader and me and Troop 328 used in the same sentence. I really, I have a job and I have other things to do and all of that. And when the tragedy occurred and I had this little bit of time to reflect on it, that conversation came back to me. And in the end, I think I thought, maybe what the young men of the troop need right now is someone they like, and someone they trust and someone they feel like they could talk to, because we had a lot of healing to do. And, that maybe in that moment, that was more important than they're having a leader who knew 3 ways to start a fire without matches or, whatever it might be. And, I would also add that 3 other people who were much more qualified than I was stepped up at that moment and said, look, we don't have the bandwidth. We're too busy, whatever. We can't do the Scoutmaster thing, but we will be your assistant Scoutmasters.
Oh, nice.
And, it's easy to make promises like that in the heat of a moment like that, right? And it would be very understandable if they had failed to deliver. And instead, the opposite happened. And they all stepped up and really were able to kind of handle the nuts and bolts of the program while I got my feet under me over the first, really year plus probably. But we were a team for several years, and it worked out really well.
So, one of the things that I think of, and we have a lot of leaders that are listening in, young leaders, new leaders. And one of the things that leaders sometimes get themselves into is they end up becoming in charge of people that know more about something than they do. And here you have an example where you're not an outdoor expert, you're not a scout expert. How do you take on a leadership role where you are not the smartest, most experienced person in the room? Sure, you're an adult, you've had life lessons that you certainly can pass on to this group, but was it intimidating not knowing that? I mean, you obviously had assistants helping you, but was it a bit intimidating, and how did you overcome some of that?
It was, and my two pieces of advice in that situation for anybody in a situation like that, not whether there's a tragedy involved or not, but stepping into a leadership role, is there are really two sides of the same coin. One is don't be afraid to ask for help. So, I wasn't shy about, a lot of times in business settings, we're very protective of our turf, right? And we don't like to admit our weaknesses and bring in people who are good at those things. And that's the wrong approach, right? We need to admit and we need to ask for help. And the flip side of that, the other side of that coin is don't be afraid to admit that you don't know what you don't know. When I became Scoutmaster, really about the very first thing I did was send an all hands email to all the families in the troop. And I said, look, this decision has been made. I have very little experience at this. This is a difficult time for the troop, and we need your help. Right. So not just those three guys who stepped up to be assistant scoutmasters, but a lot of people, just because of that ask, stepped up and took on more responsibilities and volunteered for new things they hadn't done before. And a year later, we were able to do like two separate activities on the same weekend because we had this whole group of people, adults who were chipping in to help. And, that was a really valuable leadership lesson there too, is just don't be afraid to ask.
Yeah, those are two great tips for anyone listening in. That you should, don't be afraid to ask for help and admit when you don't know something. I think those are humility is a key leadership trait that some people find out the hard way when they try to put too much ego into it and when they don't actually have the experience to back it up. So being readily willing to admit you need help is a good characteristic to have as a leader for sure.
It is, and I think in part it comes with age and experience too, because I flash back when I was 28 years old, my wife and we got married that year and we moved to Baltimore so I could be program director for a radio station. So here I was managing a staff of, full and part-time, probably 10 people. And I think every single one of them was older than I was, maybe all but one, and some were a couple of decades older. And I was so sort of bent on being the boss and appearing to know everything and all that, it didn't go very well, and I wish I'd known then what I do now to not be afraid to admit your weaknesses and your shortcomings and to be more collaborative. And, that's so important now in leadership.
Absolutely. So what I was going to ask you is, obviously it's a unique situation. The kids are going through something that no young person should have to go through, the death of their friends, their beloved scoutmaster, right? But I often see sometimes that we as leaders take on jobs sometimes when there's been a big organizational shift. There's been an acquisition. There's been a change of command, right? And a beloved leader leaves, and you end up stepping into a role of a previous manager. And with change, it's always difficult. So what I was curious is, how did you lead these young men emotionally, and how do you trying to deal with the feelings they had, talk us through a little bit about just the emotional side of leadership in a role like this.
I think the most important thing we did as a group was we did not hide from what had happened or try to sweep it under the rug. We talked about it regularly. Often at the end of a meeting where we do our announcements and things like that, if there had been a new development as the case wound its way through the courts or, whatever had happened in the news, we would sit and we would talk it out as a group. And the boys were there for each other through that difficult time. And they knew that, if they did have a moment, that somebody was there to talk to, whether it was another scout, whether it was an adult or whatever. And I think, you can't compare corporate change to a horrific human tragedy like that, but there are parallels. And I think part of it is, don't pretend it didn't happen, right? You may be in a position where you have to say, look, I know you love whoever it was who just got shown the door, and I'm not him or her, but here's who I am and here's what I expect of you. And let's see if we can make this work moving forward.
Mm. The when did you start feeling comfortable that you were in this leadership role and you felt like, okay, I'm the leader now. This, I'm feeling a little comfortable. What was that transition like as you sort of stepped up and you had all these, 40 eyes looking at you for guidance?
Yes.
When did you start feeling comfortable about it?
I think I started to feel comfortable with the scouting part, with the part I was weak on, maybe after, probably took a good year, really, of, just working through and really understanding how things worked behind the scenes and the skills required and learning some of those skills myself at adult leader training and things like that. I think one of the good things about that was it gave me a little extra measure of empathy as a leader where, when we went on a trip, a lot of times, when you step into that wobbly canoe and you don't know what's downstream, well, that a lot of times that was the first time for me as well as for the scouts. So, we had plenty of experienced help on hand, so everybody was safe. But, that sort of gives you a little more empathy for what your troops are going through at that point.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you're experiencing the first time is the same time they are.
Yeah, true.
So part of it, and the other thing, part of this book, and I want to get to is that at some point you found yourself out of work,
right?
And so you had a big life change that occurred in your occupation. And I was wondering what that experience was like for you. And how did that experience with the scout troop sort of help your thinking in that? And why did you ultimately choose to become an entrepreneur at that point?
Well, that's a well-packed question. Thank you. So about 4 years into my 5-year tenure as a scoutmaster, I guess, I lost the job that I'd had for a little over 2 decades. Mm-hmm. And, it was a fairly sizable remodeling company here in Baltimore, and the ownership had changed about a year before, and it did not go well. It was an extremely difficult year for me. And then finally, that was that, and I was gone. And so I started to look for another job because that was all I ever knew how to do was, assume that somebody else was going to hand me a paycheck and take care of my benefits and all of that. And the flaw in that strategy was that there was not a whole lot of demand for a 51-year-old self-taught marketer at that point. And I like to say, I sent a bunch of resumes all over the place, and then I buried a handful more in the backyard and got pretty much the same result. And so our son is now our son, the Boy Scout, is now a year away from going to college, and we didn't know where it would be, but, we had that on the horizon. His sister 3 years behind him. And my wife had always worked a couple of part-time jobs, but I was the main breadwinner and provider of health care. And that was a very, very difficult summer here in the Rafferty household. And then a couple of people came to me, one from Scouts, one from a former job who had started his own thing, one from a family out of town, and said, could you take a look at my website, or could you stop in and talk about my marketing, or could you look at this proposal I have from somebody, And I thought, well, maybe there's a path here, And I know this, though, like the pre-scouting Jim would have taken on that work as the side hustle, and I would have kept looking for the job and the safety net and the regular paycheck until I found one, whether it was something I wanted to do or not, just because that's how I was wired. But the Jim who had all these physical adventures and things like, down to the bottom of the Grand Canyon for 4 nights and then back out, some of the high adventure scouting trips we did and things like that. I said, you know what, there's a path here. Let's do it. And I hung out my shingle as a consultant and told the state of Maryland to stop sending the unemployment checks. And that was not quite 10 and a half years ago. And I have never been happier. I was just listening to one of your other episodes I wrote it down, Julie Noonan, talking about obsolescence. And she talks about getting into consulting and how much she loved it because of the freedom you have and everything about it. However you want to measure success, whether it's, money or loving your work or schedule flexibility or, whatever, it really checks all the boxes. And for me, every client is different. Every need is different. There's no, every day is different. And I just love that in my work. But the important thing here is that revelation, that connection between the scouting experience being thrust into that leadership role and stepping into consulting, stepping off the ledge into entrepreneurship, that took a while for me to connect those dots in my head. It wasn't like in September of 2012, I said, hey, I hiked the Grand Canyon, therefore I'm going to go, launch a business. It comes later, and I always talk about this. And when I speak to a group about getting out of your comfort zone, I say the one part we miss when we do that, when we do the thing that scares us, when we challenge ourselves, the part we miss is to take time and reflect on it and look back and think about, well, what happened? What went right? Why did I do that? What went wrong? What would I do differently next time? And that's so important, because if I hadn't done that, I never would have really connected those dots. There would be no book, for one, and we know, which is okay. But, it's really the way the scouting part connected directly to having the guts to step off the ledge and become an entrepreneur. That's the full story of Leader by Accident. It starts with the tragedy, but it's not about the tragedy at all.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Leadership skills are like any other skills. You need to practice them to get better at them. Best-selling leadership author John S. Rennie knows this. That's why he's written a new book called You Have the Watch. It's a guided journal for leaders designed to take you through an entire year of leadership training. By the end of the year, you will master 50 of the most important leadership skills. If you want to have a greater impact on the results and people in your organization, go to youhavethewatch.com and pick up your copy today.
This podcast is brought to you by Jeremy Clevenger Fitness. As a high-performing leader, you know that leadership isn't about telling people what to do, it's about leading by example. And for most people, the one area they are lacking when it comes to leading by example is their health and fitness. By improving your health and fitness, every other area of your life improves. But how do you get and stay fit as a busy leader? Well, you do what you've always done. You hire the best person for the job. Now, don't struggle on your own. Put Jeremy Clevenger on your team. Jeremy will work with you to help take your physique, mindset, nutritional habits, and more to the next level with his step-by-step, all-inclusive coaching program. Now, I've worked with Jeremy for the past year, and I'm in the best shape of my life. So if you want to step up your game, reach out to Jeremy at jeremyclevengerfitness.com to find out more and get your initial consultation scheduled with him today. This episode is brought to you by the Fraternity of Excellence. The Fraternity of Excellence is an online and real-world community for men who are looking to improve in all areas of their lives. The men of FOE are working together to become better husbands, fathers, and leaders at work and in their communities. They live by a simple philosophy: as iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. Now, I've been a member for more than 3 years, and for me, I finally found a brotherhood of men that I was missing from my time in the military. Now, I love being around guys who are dedicated to becoming a better version of themselves. So if you're interested in becoming a man of excellence as well, go to fraternityofexcellence.com, or you can reach out directly to me to learn more. Yeah, it's the journey, and I love how you say that once we depart the comfort zone, there's just an experience that we get that's it's different. I mean, I was a corporate guy, similar. Well, you weren't corporate, but you're a big company. But I was a corporate guy that I would have been comfortable just staying in corporate jobs. But it seemed to me that the corporations had changed. They kept changing. They kept getting where it was not any fun anymore. And but a lot of guys just stay in it because it's comfortable, And I took the leap 7 years ago, started my own business, and
good for you.
And it's scary, right? Because it's all you, right? There is no safety net. As much as you can be frustrated with corporate life or working for somebody else, there's a steady paycheck there, and there's maybe it's not fulfilling, but at least it pays the bills, right? And so when you go off and hang out your own shingle like that, there's a lot of fear, but it's almost the fear of stepping in a canoe with a bunch of 15-year-olds and what I mean? There's that, and you've overcome that. You've had a high watermark. You've done something difficult. That means you can do other things that are difficult.
Yes. Yeah. And that's exactly right. One challenge, overcoming one challenge gives you the courage to try the next one, I think. And it doesn't mean you'll succeed 100% of the time, but none of us do, and that's okay. And as far as I spend very little time, really no time in the corporate world, except if you want to count like being a radio announcer for, the big, mega radio corporation. Right. From the outside, though, what I see over the last 30 years, and this is going a little bit down a rabbit hole maybe, but it seems to me that corporations, a lot of corporations, have started managing to their shareholders instead of their stakeholders, instead of their employees and their customers. And, I see it a lot as a marketing consultant. I see it with, Google and Facebook and places like that, where, if you're a small business, it's no longer optional, to be associated with Google. That Google business listing is very important to your business, right? But when something goes wrong with it, try contacting a human being. They really have not accepted the responsibility of creating this ecosystem that requires us to participate. That should be a two-sided equation, and it's not. And more or less the same story with Facebook, with dealing with them with the advertising side of Facebook, which I know most people don't touch. But it's very frustrating to me to see, because I think everybody could make plenty of money and still do a much better job of keeping their customers and employees happy.
I agree with that.
That's my sidebar rant. Sorry, it has nothing to do with anything we were going to talk about.
You touched on something that made me think. You said in your role when you were working in the project management, with the projects business, that you led a certain way, but you learned a new way to lead when you were leading the scout troop. And I was wondering, what are some of those things that you learned when you were in that kind of role and you were dealing with these personal relationships with these, I would imagine eventually there was girls that came into the troop, but these boys and girls, what sort of things did you learn that you wish you had done differently as a leader?
Yeah, I think, what we already talked about, right? Being honest about what you don't know, help from others, being sort of less territorial about your power. I think that's number one. And I think we largely got that right with the scout troop from the beginning, because we would see that play over and over again, because, then within that, we're teaching leadership to these young men. Mm-hmm. And the thing we would see over and over again is exactly that, right? Somebody gets promoted to patrol leader or something, and they go, oh, now I get to boss these 6 other little peons around, and they have to do what I say. And, they sort of cheerfully ignore whoever it is. And he comes back to us in tears, and he gets his first leadership lesson, because that's not how it works, So I think really that is the most important part of it. And I think we're seeing that a lot in today's world. So, Leader by Accident was done and written and ready to go to the publisher before the pandemic hit. Mm. And I sort of sat on it for a while, just thinking, because none of us knew what the world was going to look like after that. And then decided to proceed with it just as it was. And it's resonated in such unexpected ways, because then here was the pandemic followed by the Great Resignation. Right. Yeah, and, so there were lots of reasons for the Great Resignation, right? People found out they could make a living on their Etsy shop, or, decided life was too short and they were going to pursue their passion. But, I've always said that people join companies and they quit bosses. Mm. And I think a lot of people quit their bosses during the Great Resignation, and there was I think the pandemic really shone a spotlight on the need for something we did really well in the scout troop, and that is empathetic leadership, right? We had to take into account what these young men were going through at the time of the tragedy. I mean, we could not have ignored it, right? So you as a leader, all of a sudden, you're in the office on a Friday in March of 2020, and then Monday you can't come back in, and now you're trying to manage your team via Zoom, and you can't get their nonverbal cues that you would get in the office. You can't do the small talk that would happen if you bumped into somebody in the hall. You're losing all these tools you have as a leader. And meanwhile, they're also trying to homeschool their kids or take care of an aging parent who they can't visit, or, they've got all this other pressure in their lives. And it called for new measures of empathy, I think, and not everybody, made the cut. And I think that is at least part of what was behind the Great Resignation.
Yeah, no, for sure that happened. And we saw a lot of that. Still, we see even today, the quiet quitting movement that we see here. A lot of it is through a lack of empathetic leaders, people who want to okay, pandemic's over, get back to work. Yeah. Well, wait a second, I've had a little bit of freedom, right? I've been able to take my kids to school. I've been able to start a little bit later that fit with my personal schedule. And now you're telling me I got to be back in the office. I've got to follow all the rigid rules we had prior to it. I don't feel like I want to do that anymore. And I think you're right. There's there's an important element of leadership which is empathy and understanding where people are at. And certainly you got it in spades, having to be empathetic towards these young boys who dealt with this major event. That was a big part of your job in that respect, which is being empathetic towards their feelings as they were going through trying to process what happened. But I think we don't take into account many times as leaders how important that is for just day-to-day leadership, is being empathetic to the people around you.
It is. And I was sort of smiling as you said all that, because it's very recent here. Our son, the Eagle Scout, is now 27 and he lives in Nashville, and he has his shorts in a little bit of a twist right now because his employer wants him in the office 2 days a week now and not one. And I'm like, well, Matt, you're managing 3 people now. You should be there. And he says, no, I can do it over Zoom. I'm like, well, you'll learn. I think you'll learn, But yeah. That kind of resonates right now because I just had that discussion with him.
Yeah. And I think there's some generational issues too. I mean, like I'm 55 and, my dad worked, his whole life and got the gold watch and retired. I had one job, and I expected that would be my life too. Go work for one company and then, put in all those years and retire. Like you, I went on my own and found this life as an entrepreneur, and I really enjoy it. And I think the younger people are actually doing more of this. Like you said, the gig economy, they're doing an Etsy shop. They're kind of making money on their own, and they're enjoying some personal freedom. And so sometimes our generation, it's hard for us to deal with that. Like, you should be in the office 40 hours a week.
Exactly.
Right?
That's exactly right. Yes.
We're struggling with that. And we've had guests on the show talking about the generational differences between how work is conducted. But it's like you said, being empathetic towards everyone that's working for you and what their struggles are and what they've been going through. And when we do that, we're a better leader. I like to say that leadership is a people business, right? And it's all about people. And everything that you were doing as a Scoutmaster was about people,
Yes.
Yes. There was a mission. We got to get to the bottom of the canyon and get everybody up to the top alive. Mm-hmm. That's the mission. But It was the people that was the most important part of that.
Right. And the hard part to remember sometimes is that it's about people who aren't you, right?
Yes.
Right. It's about other people.
It's other people who think differently and act differently, respond differently, and have different, like I say, quirks and hangups and frustrations and those things. But that's what makes humans so beautiful, is that they have all these things behind them.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. What did you, I would say this, just, through your experience in leading the Scout troop, sort of, like I said, the accidental journey through your entrepreneurship, what have you learned through that journey that you wish more business leaders understood?
Well, what we were just talking about, I think, sort of the empathetic leadership thing. And then the other thing I get asked a lot is the advice, and you probably have too, the advice for the new entrepreneur, right? And it's really the same advice. It's don't go it alone. We all want to think we're the expert and all that. I mean, I sat down and I would say, I would back up from there. I'd say, first of all, whether you're contemplating being an entrepreneur or not at this moment, do whatever you can to build your network. Right. Make business friends, go to networking things, and a certain subset of people get really antsy about going to networking events. Oh, I'm not good at small talk. Neither am I, but you'll get better at it. But that's the one thing I wish I had done, was build my network more when I still had the job, because it would have made life much easier when I did become an entrepreneur. But, when I made that decision, I reached out to basically everybody I knew and just said, listen, can we have a cup of coffee? Here's what, we would, and I would sit down and say, look, here's what I'm thinking of doing, and what do you think, and any advice and all that. And people are so giving. I mean, I sat down with people I was going to compete with, in one way or another. And one of them gave me copies of the agreements he uses with clients and said, here, just customize these and use them yourself, just incredibly generous stuff. And then the other thing that happens is maybe half the time, one of those people will say, you know who you need to talk to, and they make another introduction for you.
Yes.
And the network grows and the web grows. And before you know it, you have this network to draw on, and it kind of happens organically. I've been very, very lucky that I really haven't had to go knock on doors for business. It's come to me from knowing people and from going to talk about don't go it alone, right? Going to monthly peer group meetings, business peer group meetings that I participate in, and now I facilitate one every month. Those are terrific, and I think indispensable, especially for a solo entrepreneur. So it's sort of that whole thing. But I think there's very few spaces where you can go be a solo entrepreneur with blinkers on and just shutting out the outside world. You really do need other people to help you.
That's such good advice.
And they will. Yeah.
Yeah. I know for me, I was in corporate, I was a big fish in a small pond, but nobody knew me outside of the big company. And I didn't keep my connections fresh,
Yep.
and when I left corporate and I started my own company, it was some of that like, oh shoot, I didn't keep my connections fresh. And now suddenly I was reaching out to people like, hey, I started a company, and so I would say, encourage people who are listening in, and maybe you're not an entrepreneur. Maybe you're working in a big company, or, you're a manager of a local retail outlet, but, keep your connections fresh, maintain your network, because you never know when you might need that network if you start going out on your own. But yeah, maintain that network is really important. And I would say the other thing is, for me, at least, I didn't have a personal brand. Nobody knew who I was outside of my big company. And so had I built a personal brand, something that people knew who I was and what I stood for, it'd have been easier once I became an entrepreneur. Like, oh, you're the guy that knows websites, or you're the guy that knows leadership, or, so I had no personal brand. So I was basically zero when I started as an entrepreneur. And so I think that's really good advice as far as keeping your network fresh. Don't go it alone. Find those resources. And if you do it right, you're not going to be hurting for business. You're going to have your connections bringing you things.
Yes, and the other thing that really helps, I think, and again, I learned this a little later, but even from square one, look for opportunities to give. I mean, other people will help you with advice and they'll make connections for you, but also be thinking about, ask them, who's your ideal customer? What can I do to help you? Who do I know that I can make an introduction to? The more you can do that, and that will get you through a lot of networking events too, because I know people fear and dislike those things, and I'm that way a little bit myself, as I said. But if you go into those instead of going, oh my gosh, I need to get 2 new leads tonight, or this is a failure. If you go in and say, I want to just get to know 2 people better tonight, and see if maybe one of them I can connect to somebody I know and do them some good, then the whole ball game changes. The pressures, it's not about you anymore. And it comes back to you over and over and over again.
How can I help 2 people tonight?
Right, exactly.
And if you help 2 people, likely they're going to help you in the future. This reciprocity, where we feel that as humans, like, well, you did something for me, I've got to do something for you.
Yep.
And that's a great piece of advice. Wow, Jim, this has been great. There's so many nuggets of wisdom in here. This is such an important book. It's called Leader by Accident. How can people find out more about you, your company, and this book?
They can go to leaderbyaccident.com. And the book is available. I mean, you can buy it there, but you can buy it from Amazon or Barnes & Noble or any of the usual places in print, or for your Kindle or Nook, or audiobook read by the author, because he used to be a radio announcer. That's how I spent my entire winter last year, was recording the audiobook. So,
you know what? I'm envious of you. I've not done that on my books. I hired somebody with your voice.
Yeah, that was smart. It takes a long time.
It's a long time, and so I commend you for doing it. I think authors should read their books. I just didn't do it myself. So.
But yeah, leaderbyaccident.com.
leaderbyaccident.com. We're going to go ahead and put links in the show notes for those resources. But I really encourage leaders, pick this book up, learn the lessons. I always think the best way we can learn to be a great leader is to learn the lessons from others and hear their journey, hear their stories. This is full of stories. You're a great storyteller. And I really encourage people to pick this up, called Leader by Accident. Jim, thank you for coming on the show and sharing these experiences with us.
What a fun conversation. Thank you, John.
Well, thanks again. Well, that's it for today. Thank you for listening to Deep Leadership. If you like this podcast, please subscribe and share so we can continue to build a world with better bosses. Until next time, this is John Rennie saying take care and lead well.
Thank you for listening to Deep Leadership.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you for all you do.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. For more information and updates, please visit our website at www.deepleadershippodcast.com or johnsrennie.com. Until next time, take care.
Miles, are you ready to record our promo for Season 2 of the Wanna Bet podcast?
David, have you ever seen a grown man naked?
Miles, we're not here to quote lines from Airplane. We're here to tell people that Season 2 starts August 18th.
But I like Airplane.
I know you do, but Wanna Bet is a sports betting podcast. Each week we bet $1,000 on the NFL teams and games that we love.
Well, that sounds like fun.
It is fun. And last year you picked over 60% of your games correctly.
How'd you do?
We're not talking about that. We are telling people that they can find us every Friday. So no more movie quotes.
Roger.
Electricast.
Are you a fan of classic cinema or a young person who wants to discover the best films of all time? Do these legendary movies still hold up?
On the Generation Film podcast, two guys who grew up when movies dominated the culture share a great film with a panel of young movie lovers and see how it plays for today's generation.
We discuss changes in storytelling styles, representation,
The making of each film, its initial reception, and how its meaning has changed over the years.
Join us as we explore cinema classics across generations on Generation Film.
Electricast.